The following program contains adult themes. Some scenes may be too intense for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. How can a victim of childhood violence and abuse turn killer herself? And how can a person entrusted with the care of innocent children take their lives?
She learned, essentially, a negative means by which to get attention, and in essence, it became almost habitual for her.
Christine was real good at fooling everybody. She apparently fooled several medical examiners for several years on these deaths.
All my life I wanted fame, publicity, anything leads with a movie star. And killing, I guess, was a way to attract that attention from other people.
Children are defenseless. Because of this, we choose their friends and guardians with care. But it's a parent's worst nightmare when their children are actually in danger from those who are most trusted. I'm Teresa Saldana, and this is Confessions of Crime. Each year in America, millions of children are entrusted to the care of others when parents are working or going out. And by and large, they're perfectly safe. But sometimes, a parent's worst nightmare can come true. And when it does, we may not even recognize it. In the startling case you'll hear about tonight, the mystery of what happened to 5 children who lived and died in the Florida Panhandle seemed only to deepen until one person came into focus. A teenage girl by the name of Christine Falling. Using her taped interrogation by the authorities, as well as an exclusive interview with her, we will explore the thoughts and events that place Christine Falling at the heart of the mystery. On February 25th, 1980, the parents of 2-year-old Cassidy Johnson were at work. Suddenly, while they were gone, their daughter was rushed to a Florida hospital by her babysitter. Cassidy was unconscious. For 3 days, she was in a coma, still clinging to life. Then she died. The cause of death was determined to be an inflammation of the brain. Almost exactly 1 year later, in February 1981, 4-year-old Jeffrey Davis took an afternoon nap on the sofa. His parents were also at work. His babysitter was apparently watching television. Jeffrey never woke up. The cause of death was determined to be an inflammation of the heart. 3 days later, 2-year-old Joe Boy Spring was left with Christine, his mother Geneva's stepsister, while Geneva attended little Jeffrey Davis's funeral. Joe Boy was put down for an afternoon nap. He, too, never woke up. The cause of death was again determined to be an inflammation of the heart. 5 months later, in a nearby Florida town, 8-month-old Jennifer Daniels was taken by her mother Geneva, who was now using her maiden name, to a local clinic for immunization shots. On the way home, Geneva stopped at a grocery store. Once again, she asked her stepsister, Christine, who was with her in the car, to take care of Jennifer while she went inside. When Geneva got back to the car, the baby wasn't breathing. They rushed to an emergency room where Jennifer was pronounced dead. The cause of death was determined to be sudden infant death syndrome. Finally, in July of 1982, Travis Coleman, who was only 8 weeks old, was entrusted by his parents to his babysitter to stay overnight in her trailer. The following morning, he was dead. The cause of death was again initially thought to be sudden infant death syndrome. With the death of Travis Coleman, the previous 4 deaths, which had appeared to be unrelated, now began to form a pattern. There was one common thread that ran through these deaths. All 5 children had died while under the care of one person, and that person was Christine Falling. It seemed like sheer coincidence. Although Christine was uneducated and poor, she was loved and respected by all the families who had placed their children in her care.
Christine was my baby doll. She was my baby doll, and I loved her.
She was always sweet. She was always the neighborhood babysitter. She loved kids. We probably played babysitting more than we played house or dolls or anything else.
If you saw her in the context of an individual who picked up a child when she came into your house, who was kind to them, who cared for them in your presence, who did the right things with them in your presence, you would give to her the effect of trusting. Somebody I can leave my child with.
She babysat my little girl one time at the trailer park, and she took her outside, she strolled her, and she took real care of her.
As each of these infants died, the parents never suspected foul play. It just didn't seem possible. And yet there had to be some connection. The first thought was that Christine might be carrying some strange virus, that she was a typhoid Mary. But Christine agreed to be tested by doctors who couldn't find anything. It was a baffling case. Then a doctor, forensic pathologist Joseph Sapala, discovered some troubling evidence. He autopsied the fifth victim, Travis Coleman, and found signs that the baby had been choked to death.
An autopsy was performed, and during the autopsy, I noticed that there was hemorrhage into the soft tissues around the trachea being the windpipe. I then called up Sheriff Smith and Chief Deason and alerted them to the possibility that this was a homicide and told them that they should investigate this death as a homicide.
Sheriff Buddy Smith of Calhoun County had known Christine ever since she was a child. Once Dr. Sapala gave him evidence that Christine may have been murdering the children. Sheriff Smith talked to Christine. He did not press her too strongly. She told him that she was feeling suicidal, and he suggested psychiatric help. Christine was admitted to Tallahassee Memorial Hospital. It was almost as if she wanted to tell the truth, but she couldn't. Not just yet.
She told us she knew how the babies died, but at that time she just wasn't quite ready to tell us. So we visited with her a little while and came on home. Told her if she needed to talk to us any further, to just call us.
It was like a game because I got away with the first one because they couldn't tell what actually happened, and I wasn't gonna tell them. You know, if they dumb enough they can't figure it out for themselves, then why should I tell them? I mean, they're doctors. You know, it was like a game with me. I was getting away with it.
Christine craved attention and would do anything to keep it. While in the hospital, she got what she so desperately needed. She had to be the center, the focal point, and she had a spellbinding secret to tell. She started to confess to the murders.
She called back, said, "I need to talk to you." And so we went back to Tallahassee Goodwood, and that's when she told us of the deaths of these children. And she told us she knew how they died. She told us that she did choke them to death.
I don't even know why I did none of that. And you use the same method on all five of them, where you just choke them again. Some of them irritated you. Some of them didn't, is that right? No, they're not killing. That's about all I say. I don't know why.
Why had Christine Falling killed 5 innocent children? What could motivate a woman to take the lives of the children placed in her care? We'll search for the causes hidden in Christine's own childhood with its terrible secrets when we return. The police had their suspect, but they didn't have a motive. Were the reasons for the crimes locked in her childhood? Christine Falling was only 17 years old when she murdered her first victim, Cassidy Johnson. What kind of childhood had Christine experienced that could allow her to so callously take a child's life? When she was just 3 years old, Christine and her 5-year-old sister Carol were put up for adoption. They went to live with Jesse and Dolly Falling in Florida. Jesse was a successful small-time carpenter, and Dolly was his God-fearing wife.
Christine was the product of a teenage relationship. Her mother was 16 at the time that she was born. and was bounced around essentially from home to home, from adoptive home back to relatives and back to adoptive home and so on. The problem with this for early childhood development for Christine was that she didn't have a consistent and constant relationship with a mother figure, and this is very, very important for good personality development.
Christine created her own make-believe fantasy world, where glamour and opulence became a crucial part of her dreams.
She wanted the better things of life, you know, the fine clothes and the fine friends and all the good things that go along with it. Fame and fortune. The days that she was dreaming about being a movie star or becoming this sleek little model or something, that's the days that she was really down on herself. And she needed those ideas of life to get her through those days.
Christine had a very active fantasy life, and she often daydreamed and fantasized about being famous and being a princess in a big mansion and being well recognized by society. This is seen by psychologists as a function of a desire to compensate for very deep-seated feelings of inadequacy.
Christine's fantasies were a refuge from her abusive, alcoholic father. He beat both his adopted children and frequently locked them in the closet.
One time when he physically raped my sister, I had to stand and watch. And I tried to tell my mother what had happened, and my father got to me before I could really explain to my mother what was going on.
Christine told me that they'd had sex, you know what I mean? She told me, only she said, put the blame on Carol. And Jesse denied it. He denied it. He said it wasn't true. So I don't know whether there was anything like that went on or not. I haven't got no proof of it. I think they was trying to break up a home, if you don't know the truth. It was Christine doing it, trying to break peace between me and my husband.
I went to my mother and I told her. My mother didn't believe me. Most of the time, when I was being sexually abused, it was so that my father wouldn't abuse her. I didn't want Christine to have to go through what I was going through. And I knew if I said something about it, that our home would be wrecked. A couple of days later, my dad kind of went off the deep end on both of us. He came home drinking. And he had started arguing with Christine when she came in from school. I felt like my sister was in danger. I felt like I was in danger. And I could not get my mother to respond to help me. And he pinned her against the door frame of the garage door coming into the house. And she was turning a light shade of blue, and I was begging for help, and no one would help me.
That harrowing incident, in which Christine's father abused her so badly that she was sent to the hospital, was apparently the beginning of her desire to kill.
The first time I thought about killing was I was about 4 or 5 years old. He wrapped the telephone cord around my neck, okay? He actually intended to kill me because I was trying to call the cops on him for raping my sister in the bedroom. How can I actually get rid of him? How can I keep him from beating us anymore? How can I keep him from raping my sister? What if he ever tries to rape me? So it was like I had plans of formulated in my head of wait until he goes to sleep and cutting his throat, or stabbing him, or setting him on fire. It was, to me it was fun because he enjoyed beating me, so why couldn't I enjoy killing him?
Eventually, the abuse became public and the authorities stepped in. Christine and Carol were to be sent to a girls' reform school. But what could have been a turning point in Christine's life backfired and only drove her deeper into despair. Her only ally, her big sister, never made it to the school. At 14, Carol became pregnant and got married. leaving Christine alone for the first time in her life.
She was my idol. You know, she was I tried to follow in her footsteps instead of my parents' footsteps. And a lot of times I was disappointed, like when she got married at 14, had her baby at 14. I had to go to Thomasville, Georgia Girls' School. She was supposed to meet me a week later there. So during that week, she decides to get married. After she didn't show up, it was like she lied to me, and I wanted to hurt her because everything wasn't all right. You know, I didn't have her anymore.
With no family, no friends, no constant love and attention from Carol, Christine began to drift, looking for somewhere to belong.
After she got to be a 14, 15 years old girl that done quit going to school, then I told her, I said, Christine, it's getting time for you to get out there and work and make your living now. I said, me and your daddy has took care of you, and I said, I'm not going to take care of you after you're grown. I said, I'm not going to do it. She says, well, somebody's going to take care of me all of my life.
I kind of attached myself to the school gang, skipping school with them, did dabbing in drugs, and to fit in, I would do whatever they was doing, which they were high school kids and I was in junior high. And so we got stealing cars for joyrides, breaking and entering to stereo stores, stealing stereos, breaking into houses, you know. And, you know, I figured that, you know, at the time I thought it was fun. You know, I fit in with this crowd. You know, they was there for me when I needed someone. You know, they didn't turn their back on me. They didn't tell me, well, we don't have time to talk to you right now. So it was like another family that actually had time for me.
Christine Falling's childhood had been violent and abusive, but how did she take the ultimate step from victim to killer? In a moment, in more of our exclusive interview with Christine, we'll go inside a murderer's mind and try to understand why she killed. Christine Falling choked 5 small children to death, children she cared about. What kind of person could commit such outrageous crimes? Did Christine simply live outside the normal rules of society? Had she lost all human emotions?
I never realized I was going to murder until it happened. I had dreams of killing. You know, it was more or less like a game.
She felt even more powerful than God because nothing could stop her from carrying it out. And I think this speaks to the unresolved child abuse. The abused child is, after all, full of feelings of powerlessness, inadequacy, and helplessness.
It don't necessarily have to do with defenseless children. It don't have to do with grown-ups. It's just the power itself of knowing that you can take a life regardless if it's child, man, woman, infant, whatever.
In her case, clearly, the tremendous buildup of emotion that was inside of her, that was bottled up, was released during the murder event. And serial killers will say that when they kill somebody, there is a tremendous sense of relief and a sense of calm that comes over them.
The callousness and brutality of Christine's murders are chilling. But bizarre as it sounds, were her killings and then her ultimate confessions a cry for attention?
Killing was the best way to achieve fame, not the best kind of fame, okay? Notoriety and TV's newscasters brought nationwide, public television, radios, newspapers. That's the best publication you can get. But with murders, to go to the extent to murders to get those dreams is not the best. Believe me, I've lived through it. All my life I wanted fame, publicity, Anything leads with a movie star. And killing, I guess, was a way to attract that attention from other people. Okay, other people was drawing that attention that I wanted. Other movie stars, other cases of murder, presidents. Okay, I resented them.
When the cameras were in the courtroom, I recall her turning around and smiling at the TV cameras constantly. I mean, she was an artist. She was, you know, she was there and she was the center of attention. She was the attraction and she was enjoying every minute of it.
Out of abuse, neglect, feelings of abandonment and rage, a monster was born. A monster whose cry for identity demanded the death of others so that she could feel alive.
It's hard to say now what was going through my mind then. The best I could say was hate, anger, to the point where I wish everybody was dead and I was the only one alive. Then maybe I could get some attention.
Christine Falling pled guilty to murder and received multiple life sentences. She will be eligible for parole in the year 2007. Her own abuse, suffered at the hands of her father, had helped make her not a caregiver, but a killer. It's a sad lesson in how violence in the home teaches more violence, and how some children who have been abused can actually become abusers themselves. And although we must not become paranoid, we can never relax our vigilance with the choices we make in our children's care. Also, as this story shows, when a child dies, a mistaken medical diagnosis may prove tragic. Perhaps 4 children could have been saved if Christine's first victim, Cassidy Johnson, had been seen for what she was, the victim not of brain inflammation, but of murder. I'm Teresa Saldana. Join me again next time for an extraordinary journey into the criminal mind on Confessions of Crime.